All right. I'm just gonna let everyone kind of filter in for a minute, and then maybe I'll get us. We're one over the hour, so I'll get us started with a little quick introduction. Hello, everyone. My name is Cynthia Chen. I am the manager of public policy at Westaff. She, her pronouns. I am a Asian female wearing red glasses, long wavy black hair, and a white shirt. And I'm joining us all today from Washington, D.C., which is the ancestral homelands of the Cottonshank, Anacostan, and Piscataway peoples. I'm so glad that you all are joining us here today as attendees and our panelists. And if you haven't had a chance to check out our virtual lobby, you can go and find our introduction video there that I'm welcoming you all to this event. But today we're here to talk about policy for creative workers, what we've subtitled Once in a Generation Opportunities. And we'll get into that into the panel. And just a quick note for you all who are in attendance, we're definitely going to have a Q&A at the end of the session. So if you want to start thinking about some questions you want to ask our panelists, that would be greatly appreciated. And then at that point, we'll have one of our other Westaff staff members kind of managing that as well. So I'm just going to see if people are settled in while people are getting settled in. All right, I think that gives us a little bit of time. I think I'm going to pass it over to our moderator, Julie Baker from Californians for the Arts. We're super lucky to have this wonderful panel gathered in front of us today. So thanks for being a moderator, and we'll let you all introduce yourselves.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Cynthia. Thanks to Westaff, such an important partner in advocacy work, particularly for those of us in the Western states. And we really appreciate their support at California Arts Advocates. My name is Julie Baker. I'm the executive director of both Californians for the Arts and California Arts Advocates. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I have at the top of my hair is kind of brown. By the bottom, it's kind of blonde. And in between, there's some gray. And then I'm wearing large blue glasses and a white shirt with polka dots and a little handkerchief around my neck, I suppose, scarf around my neck that's also got polka dots, and orange earrings and color. I started to wear a lot more color as I'm aging. 55-year-old woman, and let's see what else. I'm coming from the land of the Nevada City Rancheria Nisenan, otherwise known as Nevada City, California, about an hour northeast of Sacramento. And I'm going to go in alphabetical order, so I'm going to go hand it to Candace.
Hey everyone, good to be here. My name is Candace Kita. I am the Cultural Strategy Director at APANU, which is the Asian Pacific American Network of Oregon. I use she, her pronouns. I have lighter skin, kind of a round face, dark brown, shoulder-length hair, brown eyes, and some freckles. And I am wearing a white collared shirt. I currently reside on the traditional lands of the Multnomah, Clackamas, and Cowlitz peoples, otherwise known as Portland, Oregon.
Thanks, Candace. We'll hand it to Wendy.
Yes, thanks, Julie. Hi, everyone. I'm Wendy Levy, the Executive Director of the Alliance for Media, Arts, and Culture. I am a 61-year-old white Jewish woman with silver hair, black glasses. I'm wearing a black shirt with a blue scarf. Behind me is a beautiful red and colorful poster celebrating the Alliance's 40 years serving the media arts community. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I come from Spokane, Washington, the ancestral land of the Spokane tribes, Kalispel, and Colville Confederated Tribes. Pleasure to be here.
Thanks so much, Wendy. And we'll hand it to Michelle, and then we'll circle back with Isa.
Great. Thank you so much, Julie. Great to be here. Good morning, afternoon, depending on where you're calling in from. My name is Michelle Ramos. She, her, ella are my pronouns. Today, I am actually calling in from the lands of the Shoshone, Goshute, Ute, and Paiute folks, Native Indigenous folks, land and territory now known as Salt Lake City, Utah. However, home base is actually the native indigenous lands of Bulbancha, now known as New Orleans, Louisiana. I am the executive director of Alternate Roots, a 45-year-old organization based across 14 states in the South, supporting artists that do work in social justice. I am an Afro-Latina woman with brown skin. I have shoulder-length salt and pepper hair, brown eyes, and I am wearing a black t-shirt covered by a charcoal gray sweater. It's good to be here with you.
Go for it, Isa.
Thanks, Julie. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. My name is Isa Villarosa. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm here in the land of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples in the Bay Area. I am with the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, and I am their Senior Director of External Affairs. Part of the why behind our work at YBCA is our origin story. Yerba Buena was part of San Francisco's displacement of communities of color of Filipino Manongs in the South of Market neighborhood in San Francisco. And so we have a mandate to community. We are an art institution, but we are also a convener, and we work at the intersection of art and advocacy. And prior to YBCA, I was at the Insight Center for Community Economic Development, looking at the wealth gap by primarily race and gender. And it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Julie. I'm in a very, very blank room as I have just relocated. I'm a Filipina, and I have a blemish on my face because a bike fell on me this morning. Interesting story there. And I'm wearing a black and white striped shirt with short cropped hair.
Well, the good news is I can't see any blemish, but I'm sorry that you experienced that this weekend or whenever it was this morning. Well, thank you so much. It's a total honor to be moderating this panel with such amazing thought leaders and organizers for this moment in time in particular. And the title for this session is Policy for Creative Workers, Once in a Generation Opportunities. And I thought in a way for you all to center and sort of unpack that title, it would be helpful if we, in introducing the work that you do, if you talk a little bit about how you define in your work creative workers, and why is this the moment? What does it mean in terms of once in a generation opportunity? Why did WestAF choose that? Why do you think they chose that? And what do you see in your work? So I'm going to actually go ahead and start with Michelle.
Great. Thank you so much, Julie. So yes, creative workers. And I think as one of the only panelists here representing folks from the South, I will say that, during the time of the pandemic and, when we were in the thick of it, and there were lots of funding sources being offered and opportunities being offered to help support artists, creative workers, it was immediately clear to the folks in our region that the traditional sort of construct framework of how a creative worker defined definitely bypassed a lot of our constituency and the people that we serve, in that a lot of our artists and a lot of our arts workers define as community organizers or defined as culture bearers, and define with different descriptor terms that you don't see in a typical national arts application for funding opportunities, right? And so much so that we were actually asked to come in and weigh in on some of the lexicon and language that was being used in the national applications that were being created and circulated and drafted around. So for us, that terminology of a creative worker goes far beyond just those two words, and it really is inclusive of artists who are on the ground doing the work on the front lines in partnership with advocacy organizations and artist activists. And I think that terminology, that we've got folks that are community organizers and culture bearers who maybe don't self-define as an artist per se, but are definitely doing work that is grounded in artistry or artist advocacy. So for us, that is sort of how we define. I'll stop there.
Oh, that's terrific. It's so actually I want to go to Candace, because in looking at your organization, I mean, I guess you wouldn't it doesn't define itself as an arts organization as it is more of a community organizing advocacy organization. So tell us about the role and what you see as definition of creative workers within the work that you do, and how did that come about in terms of arts and culture, or cultural workers becoming such a focus and a program of your organization?
Yeah, thanks, Julie. I think, Michelle, I resonate a lot with your kind of how you described the folks that you work with in terms of community organizers and culture bearers. And our organization, Apano, is a kind of community-based advocacy organization. So our kind of intent and mission is to build community power, particularly with Asians and Pacific Islanders, as well as a larger BIPOC cohort in Portland. And when we think about artists, we kind of really lean heavily on kind of the intersectional identities that artists have, right? So we're thinking about artists as kind of cultural workers, as organizers, and try to be really expansive, right, in kind of what we call ourselves, because not everyone in our community who uses their creative power necessarily identifies like as an artist in that particular term and label. Just knowing that who an artist is, right, and in terms of mainstream history and discourse, tends to be centered around like a white, heteronormative idea of what an artist is and who can be an artist, right? There's kind of privilege loaded into that term. So we tend to use kind of cultural workers or organizers as well. And in using kind of cultural workers, we really think about our work kind of in the arts and culture field as one in which we're literally working on culture and using the vision and inspiration of artists and cultural workers to imagine the world we want to live in. And through doing that, we can shape hearts and minds, and that is the kind of pre-work that is necessary to move us towards more progressive policy. So we see artists, cultural workers, and organizers as key, right, in shifting culture and changing culture that paves the way for that world that we want to live in.
That's great, Ken. Thank you so much. And Isa, I'm just thinking about Yerba Buena Center's history in many ways, at least from the outside, as someone who lives in California, seeing the work that you do. You do programs, you do arts programs. You're, in a sense, starting more art-centered, and in this case now, artist-centered, as you call many of your programs, shifting a little bit. Maybe I'm wrong because I don't know the long history of the organization, but really becoming very active in community organizing, in policy development, and that sort of thing. How do you guys define creative worker, and how does that, in a sense, mirror kind of what Candace's organization is doing, Michelle's organization, but from a slightly different perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Julie. And so much of this, the through line between Michelle kicking us off and Candace calling out the very Anglo roots of, say, the starving artist narrative, are the intertwined linkages between policy and narrative change that we're really trying to address. In the Guaranteed Income Pilot for Artists that Yerba Buena Center for the Arts is currently implementing, which is a economic justice pilot where 190 artists in the city of San Francisco get $1,000 of unconditional cash for 18 months. We are confronting this narrative over and over again. And part of it is, can we humanize our data, which is linked to the definition of what it means to be a creative worker? So much of this also stems from, for example, our census data, which presupposes still a one-job system. Now, can we have an artist who is working one job? Possibly. We know that in the city of San Francisco, where the cost of childcare, for instance, has increased over 80% in the last 4 years, that for many folks, and particularly for Black and Brown and Indigenous artists, it is very, very likely that you are an artist and a gig worker. You are an artist and a parent or a caregiver struggling with those childcare costs. And how can that be seen through the data? What is heartening in this moment, and going back to your original question about why now, it's almost exclamation point, there is no better time but now, because things are so urgent. And the inspiring parts of this are rooted in community-based research at Yerba Buena, at Creatives Rebuild New York, who recently launched their guaranteed income pilot across the country. Even in Ireland, we're talking on a day-to-day basis with a global community of practice, and it's rooted in community-based research, in that artists, grassroots leaders, activists, this cohort of folks who, as Ayanna Pressley would say, those closest to the pain should set the policy. They are telling us sex workers are creative workers, right? They are giving voice to the people who aren't often in mind when we think of data, right? And it's time to flip that narrative.
Okay, I have so many questions, but I want to get first to Wendy and give her a chance to also talk about the work that you do at Arts to Work, which I, in looking at everybody's website and doing my preparation, that when you go to your website, it says a revolutionary blueprint for the future of work, new model of reform for the digital generation. What does that mean? And how do you define creative worker?
Yeah, well, I'm so grateful for this conversation because of we adopted this idea, the idea of creative worker, out of an essential need to translate the needs of our communities to government entities that had traditionally excluded artists from funding and opportunity. And we know that artists, by nature, we are plural identities. It's very few, as Isa was suggesting, are doing one thing that is a job description. And the workforce system in this country is based on this, what's your career? And every career's got a number and a code. And if you don't fit into those lines, you're excluded completely. So we made a choice at some point to say, yes, we're systems change. We want to take an industry that has been based on a culture of unpaid interns, that designed for folks who are white and privileged and know people in the industry and can work for free, and supplant that with something more equitable, more inclusive, more reflective of the lived reality of the folks who are identifying as creative workers, and trying to, so we're a bit Arts to Work, as the very first registered apprenticeship program, we're caught in a bit of a tension of our own making, where we are making a loud and proud call for funding from these deep pockets of money that go to workforce development in this country that never go to the arts, because there have been no pathways that fit in there. And so I'm like, but our organizational members have been doing this for years, training their communities, providing access to technology, supporting placement in the workforce, and they get zero credit because there's zero data that's been created. And so we're trying to create a culture of abundance. So this notion of creative worker lets us umbrella filmmakers, we call ourselves jobs for storytellers. And so that, and we are in the practice of convincing government bodies at the federal level, at the state level, at the community level, at the workforce board level, that they must think differently about how artists work. And we're starting to get some traction. It's a long haul, but we're in it till the end.
And you're the first federally registered national apprenticeship program in media arts and creative technologies. So yeah. I think interesting, and starting off with the definition, as it were, is that how critical language is, right? And how critical definition is. And Michelle, you said that, you've been asked to even help to redefine that, because if we're not being seen in certain things, whether it's workforce development or whether it's even within the silo of what the arts and culture industry does, we don't even include, we're not inclusive of how we self-define or are not being defined in that, it really does restrict how we're building our sector. And so I guess the next question, and any of you can sort of jump in on why now, because I don't think all of you got a chance to speak to that. So I'm happy to have you talk about that. But I also want you to think, and I want to ask, because I think this is sort of an important grounding question, which is, what have you seen as the most critical unmet needs for, however you define, fill in the blank, creative worker, cultural bearer, community organizer, that policy, because we are here to talk about policy, can change, right? What can policy do to solve those problems? But number one, let's talk about it. What have you seen? I mean, so you guys are working on guaranteed income, right? There's a reason. Maybe we can start with you. Tell us, why is guaranteed income helping to meet the needs of creative workers?
Sure. And it's been quite a week in the field of guaranteed income. A little background for folks: at this point in time, there are nearly 100 different guaranteed income or basic income demonstrations across the United States. In terms of guaranteed income specifically for artists, in addition to the work of YBCA, we have cohorts in Creatives Rebuild New York, as well as Springboard for the Arts in Minnesota. And as I mentioned earlier, Ireland just kicked off their pilot. And I say that to say, to the question of why now, this is not a new idea, right? This is the work of the Panthers. This is organizing by Black women, by coal miners, communities across time and geography. And yet, why did we let, for example, our wealth gap get to the point that it is? In the city of San Francisco, something that we see and hear quite often is $1,000. What is that? That's just a drop in the bucket. But what is the ocean but a million drops, right? And so part of the work and why policy can be effective here, and going back to that narrative piece, we're finding that if someone can understand the nuts and bolts of guaranteed income, i.e., that trust-based cash works, because so much of our economy takes away trust from people, right? If we look at our public benefit system, it's often built on surveillance, it's built on punitive measures, and there's also a very strong personal responsibility narrative that was started by bad policies, that was rooted in white supremacy a long time ago, but persists today. And essentially what that means is our policies are structured to blame folks for encountering poverty. So the promise of guaranteed income is that if someone can understand, okay, there's structural challenges that explain why someone cannot make ends meet, that can break open change to bigger and better policies. We're seeing some of those with SARA, for example, which is the legislation promising more integration between workforce and the creative sector, as Wendy talked about. In California, Julie, you've done so much work at the state level with this integration. And so guaranteed income is really just part of the mix. Is it a silver bullet solution? Absolutely not. Is it a way to get more traction toward baby bonds or reparation or other models that can really move the needle? Yes.
Thank you. Anyone else want to comment on what you're seeing in the work that you're doing in the communities you're working within, as the the unmet needs? What is it that what do we need to do to change things, and what can policy do? So Michelle, Candace, Wendy. Oh, unmute. There's always one.
Apologies. Yeah, I should just keep it off mute. There's a couple of things. We don't work in the unconditional, in the guaranteed income space, but we have done some research in unconditional cash transfers that have started, that organizations as big as the World Bank have done, and they've seen tremendous benefits from that. And I often wonder how we might be able to combine a guaranteed income cash transfer model as we're also building a more traditional approach to workforce development. I would hate for them to be to not be aligned, so that people felt they had to choose either or. Something that we've been working on recently is that state by state, there's a lot of money coming through the pipeline from recovery funds and the new bills that are being considered that provide benefits to small businesses who hire registered apprentices and provide additional mentorship and training as part of what they do. To the point of even in some states, you can get back 70% of the first year's salary back from by providing jobs or providing that include mentorship and helping start their own business and all of this. And I keep wondering, so we're of course lobbying for that kind of funding to come to small business owners who are owning creative businesses who do any kind of hiring. Because if you are required to do a full-time job with benefits, even the amount of money that you might be able to get to help cover that cost, it builds an unsustainable system. And so it's, I am catalyzed by the Creative Economy Revitalization Act and the California Creative Workforce Act that are both looking in a really kind of hybrid way at being able to combine different sources of funding, different sources of building, and looking at artists in a very plural way. But I really, at this point, thinking of those first jobs, those jobs that are transformative in one's life, to support those who are providing those jobs, providing that foundation for lives to change. And it's nice to sort of see these creative businesses qualify for the first time.
I was just thinking, like my notes are, trust-based cash works, unconditional cash transfers, and then I'm thinking about how we can't even get general operating support grants.
That's right.
A lot of our, and we have to fit into these things. So
Michelle,
yeah. So Michelle and Candace, I'd love for you to also identify for us within the work that you're doing. What are you hearing? What are you seeing? What are the needs? Is it guaranteed income? What else can we be thinking about? Michelle, go for it.
Sure. I mean, guaranteed income, yes, but I think, being the representative here for artists in the South, like there's just a whole nother level, right, that we are engaging with as being the most, the largest region that is the most disinvested in, right? So we're just not even at the same playing field oftentimes, not because of the work that we do, which is rigorous and important and meaningful and intentional and making huge change, but because we're not even at the point sometimes, where we are getting, recognized or being able to be viewed or seen, even just as an artist, to be put into that umbrella of creative workers who are eligible to do this and that, to be able to, so we're more than a few steps, from even being able to consider these types of things. The great thing though about the work that is happening where I am and where our artists are based is that we are very clearly and closely aligned and tied to a lot of advocacy and social justice advocates on the ground and on the front lines who are doing this work that we align with and we move forward with and are able to lend that artistry lens into this work for not only the purpose of amplification, but really just like raising awareness. And so for us, when I think about the pandemic, like our number one concern was just, how do we get policymakers? How do we get people who are moving policy just to even see, artists as human beings, right? Like just a basic, base level humanity of understanding, like when I'm spending, 8 to 12 weeks trying to advocate for funding to come to the South in the pandemic, I've got people who are like literally living in the park in tents, right? And I'm having to make the case for our artists to receive this funding. And I've got people who, are being kicked out of their homes and trying to figure out how they are going to feed their families. And not being able to, so anyway, all of that to say that just the act of some of these policies, just acknowledging that artists are human beings, right? Like they have real human concerns. And so these things like these guaranteed living wages, things like, income supplements during times of pandemic, things like emergency relief funding, all of that is at such a completely different like state and level and availability of access in the South than it is anywhere else in the country. And so, what I am seeing as a result of that is folks in my region saying, you know what, I don't think we can actually count on all these other folks to be able to deliver and support us in the way that we need support. So we need to start advocating for ourselves and raising money for ourselves and doubling down in our backyard to take care of ourselves, because we know these broader entities, these broader frameworks with which arts is viewed and seen and acknowledged and frankly accepted, isn't that's out here. That's not where we're at. So what do we need to do to take care of ourselves? And so I guess to respond to your question, what I'm seeing in my region is an honest just no thank you to the way things have been, and no thank you to the framework, and no thank you to the nonprofit industrial complex. No thank you. We are going to figure out what we need, and we are going to take care of ourselves. And so that I think is powerful. I think it's really powerful, because I think folks in my region are tired and exhausted and know that the status quo likely isn't changing. I mean, to your earlier point, I think now there is this window of time where, because of the murder of George Floyd, because of the uprisings, because of all the climate crisis things that we're witnessing, we do have a window of time where people are paying attention, and we have seen money move. And, a lot of brown and Black organizations are struggling because they've had such a surge of money coming in because of people's raised consciousness, that now they're having the struggles of a larger staff and more money. And now how do we manage all this? But that window, we know historically, will close. It always does. Philanthropy is flavor of the month. So, it's a great window. It's a great time we're in. I think we need to leverage it both on, nationally on the coast and where I am in the South. But I do think we will see the tide turn. In fact, I already am seeing the tide turn, because we know that's how this works. It's cyclical. It's predictable. It is what it is, the nonprofit industrial complex. So I'll stop there.
It's what you're talking about, at least from what I'm hearing, is how critical it is that we build local and community-based and sustainable systems to build that inherent and community-owned infrastructure to support the community in which we're serving, right, or being a part of. And I'm listening to what you're saying, and I'm thinking, absolutely, and I'm wondering how we get there, because I think that is the radical shift, that is the radical change, right? That I think many of us doing this work are trying to activate. So Candace, let me ask you, because you come from an organization that starts there. Michelle, you talked about aligning with social justice organizations, and what can we learn from the social justice organizations that have been fighting about food insecurity and housing issues and things that maybe the arts were not always leading with. But I think we're trying to recognize that this is who our workforce is, unfortunately, as you said, Michelle, because they're really not even seen as human beings and who with these types of needs. So Candace, tell us from your perspective, from the social justice community organizing perspective, what do we need to be doing to get to this vision that Michelle is talking about?
Yeah, such a good question. And, Michelle, as you were talking, I was just thinking about how I see a lot of that kind of, I don't know, I think honestly, like distrust of governmental systems, and even kind of like taking the policy route, aligning with institutions, because of the fact that folks haven't been treated well, right, by institutions and by policy in the past. And that kind of at a very big picture level, policy, in the United States has been very much shaped kind of by like individualism and kind of this idea of individualism, and not really, policies of like collective care super deeply, right? And so there's, I think like some of the cultural work, the working on culture, right, is like really, how do we even build policy that people can trust in? How do we build these systems that people do feel that they can take advantage of, that there is trust kind of built into it? And yeah, I was thinking about too, I see you mentioned kind of like more trust-based currencies, and the fact that that is not part of our systems. So what would it look like to kind of build that trust in? It's a big project, right? And, I think from like a community organizing perspective as well, something that I've been thinking a lot about, and this kind of speaks to the question like, why now, is how do cultural workers, artists, creative workers, kind of align with labor organizing movements that are happening right now? And how can we think about, labor issues in terms of really focusing on the issues and less on the identity? Because these categories are so large, right? And not everyone in an identity category is going to have the same sets of issues that are impacting them the most. So kind of getting really intersectional in how we think about what issues are most important to us and like what we want to spend our time and energy on. And that's not going to be the same for every cultural worker and artist. And I think this moment is like so particularly dynamic because there are these questions that have arisen in the pandemic around like, what is a meaningful job? What is fair labor? Like, why should I be working in this system? And I think that cultural workers and artists and creative folks have a lot of ability to vision, right? Like what that different system can be and what labor can be and what work can be that is more humanistic and less exploitative, right? So there's a lot of ability to kind of build upon the energy of this particular moment, which those questions are really coming to the fore and have been questioned in ways that I think no one could have anticipated, right? And I know I haven't seen in my lifetime before.
I'm thinking about also how, artists, cultural workers, culture bearers, creative workers have always been in movements, right? We've always been at the forefront of many of the movements, whether it's civil rights movement, women's rights movement, and Black Lives Matter. But I'm going to make a statement, and you guys can disagree with what I'm about to say too, which is that we often don't do it for ourselves, right? We've been aligned and at the forefront of all these other things. But I guess my question, thought around this is, how have you identified, and I know, Michelle, that you do this in your organization, and I know you do, I think you do it at Artist Power at your center, which is to empower the creative worker, the cultural bearer, to lead in the organizing and the movement building for ourselves, not for a different cause necessarily, or maybe we're aligning, and not having to look to the white-led institutions, the larger organizations, always to be doing this sort of, we're showing up and asked to do the work, but we're not leading in it. So what are some of the systems or things that you've employed to really empower creative workers, cultural bearers, artists to engage in this type of work? Because that's my question. Michelle, you want to take that one first?
Sure. So, Alternate Roots, my organization, 45-year-old organization, has always worked at the intersection of arts and social justice. And so, I know that, at this moment in time, there is definitely sort of a trend to the goals of artists wanting to do more intersectionality and do more intersectional things. And it's not that Roots is the only organization that has worked at that intersection. There's literally hundreds, I'm sure, across the country. But that said, I do think that just our entire, ethos and DNA as an organization is about empowering the artist, is about giving voice to that artist to engage in work that is meaningful to them, that is, uh, you know, aligned with the cause, but also in trying to do our work is to try to support that artist in furthering not just their work, but furthering themselves, right? Furthering their humanity in doing that work. It's the one thing I think that Roots really does well, is that we don't bifurcate the art from the artist, and we recognize that, you know, that artist needs to be made full to be able to provide and produce the best work that they produce, whether they're a self-defined, you know, traditional quote unquote framework artist, or a culture bearer, or a community organizer who defines as an artist. We know that those artists cannot give their best work and produce their best work and be their best selves and show up themselves on those front lines if they aren't in themselves getting fed, getting healed, getting what they need to be their fullest selves. And so our organization very much puts the focus onto the artists. And while these artists are out doing advocacy on their own and in partnership with social justice organizations, we recognize that that work, that day in and day out work on those front lines, is rigorous, hard, traumatizing, and painful. So we know we can't just stop at the artistry. We have to invest in the artists themselves. And so we really try to make a point of doing that, both in our work, in our regranting that we do, in our technical assistance, and then our just day-to-day support of our artists across our 14 states in the South.
Does anyone else want to speak to that?
Yeah, I can go, and I'm loving that when we take a leisure of this conversation, humanity is probably our most used word aside from artist, because it's really the heart of this work. In thinking about what you shared, Julie, with, you know, where do we all fit in this mix, grounded in the truth of artists always being activists. At YBCA, part of the challenge is we have found ourselves, because of this traditional model of piecemeal grants-based systems that we all have found ourselves at one point or another, YBCA has found itself in competition with the very heart and soul of community that we are trying to partner with. There is a phrase I've been thinking of in doing the work of guaranteed income, but also the Artist Power Center, which if folks are unfamiliar, I will drop that into the chat. But the Artist Power Center is a web app and a coalition building tool for artists. It's both a one-stop shop for job opportunities, advocacy opportunities, conferences, speaking engagements, digital, physical. How do we seed power to seed power? And seed, the first one being CEDE, to grow or seed power, because so much of YBCA's work is in this convening state. Often, and I want to honor Sam's question in the chat. There's a question around race that is also tied to this, and bringing it back to what you said, Julie, about how activism, you know, who is best served by activism. But I would make the case that anti-Blackness hurts us all. And if we can get to a point where we can understand the structural racism undergirding our economy, we are building that muscle to understand intersectionality. We are building that muscle to understand that artists are unique and special, but they're not superhuman. And I think so often the grants we see, you know, Michelle called out the nonprofit industrial complex. Grants so often honor the work product or the productivity of an artist, but not the artist themselves as a human. And I say that to say that in guaranteed income, for instance, with some of the community grounded research we're doing, there is a gatekeeping access point to who gets to do a guaranteed income pilot, for example. It does take time and capacity and resources. Often with guaranteed income pilots, there's something called an IRB, an institutional research board, that needs to prove the rigor of a program, which is a bit frustrating because we already know that unconditional cash can change lives, can help people. And yet we also need that body of research to move the policy. So what we're doing in our pilot right now is really being a thought partner with arts organizations who wouldn't traditionally have access to either the funding or the research bodies needed to do this work. And it does go back to this model of how do we seed power to seed power? And often that means how do we bring decentralized technology and data to communities who can do the most good with it?
You guys, I mean, I just want to sit here and listen to all of you. It's so inspiring and so much brilliance. So thank you. But you know, what I heard also is this, it feels like an interesting tension, right? On one hand, there's many of us trying, like Wendy, you're working in many ways inside the system, as it were, right? Trying to activate workforce development systems to include the creative workforce, right? That's your, at least I think that's mostly
as one of the aspects of a larger initiative, for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, I run an advocacy organization that works directly in state government, trying to influence the systems of that. I also heard a lot of it is that with this, as Candace, you talked about this distrust, and Michelle, I think you very clearly said we're not even at all at the table in many ways in terms of when you're talking about policy conversations. So we're going to go local and rooted in community and change the systems we need to do. So can we do both? Can we make systems change happen at the state, federal, local level, but have it be grounded in community? I mean, obviously that sounds like the Holy Grail. How do we do that? How do we get there?
God, Julie, that's a really good question. And I think I mean, from our perspective, we're doing both because we feel a responsibility to all of our community for both, which are individual artists as well as the organizations that support them. And I read policy, you know, as the legislation is coming down, who is it serving? Some of it reads like it's there to make the elected officials who've brought the bill to the floor, you know, to raise their profile. And it's like, as you follow the money down the text of the page, you lose the humanity of the artists and the community-based organizations that are there. So I really resonate with everything that that folks are saying about doing it for ourselves in some ways. But then I also see workers, our creative workers, who live in a culture of scarcity that are deeply wanting to emerge from there, to redefine the space, to support their families, to purchase homes. And I want to trigger, we'd like to be able to fight the fight on all fronts, to be able to create new seats of power, to say no, we say no to certain funding if it's too encumbered or put people at risk. We have to there's a new level of accountability that I'm finding that is, you know, if the government doesn't understand, you know, putting workers first and self-care and reimagining power, then we're not playing in that field. But if I see billions of dollars hanging out that are going consistently to construction and manufacturing and those workers, and that there might be a way of increasing the funding streams in a way that would not encumber people's livelihoods but really increase their access to power, then we're going to try to make it happen. But we have to be super careful every step of the way, that the folks the groups that we are tending to, who are leading this work, are the ones making those decisions. But for us, we are trying to work both sides of it. And at some point we may have to, you know, I've looked up to alternate routes ever since I was a young one in this field, and maybe, you know, wanting to be more like them is like something I, you know, every day I think maybe we should be doing that. So it's.
Michelle, or Candace, or anybody, Isa, do you have any thoughts on that? Like, How do we do it concurrently? Do we totally say, don't focus over here, focus over there? What's your advice in that for those who are listening, who are curious about where they land?
I think at Apano, we really try to, take a both and perspective on this. Also knowing that like we're a social justice advocacy organization, also mired in the nonprofit industrial complex, right? And like having to navigate that tension all day, every day. I think one helpful kind of tool that we try to, support is cultivating folks' ability, potential, and ability to navigate, right, the different systems at play, right? Whether that's like, through advocacy training or just like kind of showing how what's the phrase? Showing how the thing works, how the cake is made, right? So that folks can make that decision for themselves in terms of how and where they want to participate and like what they feel like their strengths are and what they want to contribute, right, to this movement. And knowing that like we need people everywhere, right, to do this work. So it's not like we can just focus on one particular parts of our systems. I know that one very recent happening is that we just had like our primary elections in Oregon, and 5 Asian and Pacific Islander candidates won, right? Which went up from like 0 that were represented in local and state legislature. And that was done through, a lot of organizing work over the years. And in that movement, right, having folks that, our community trusts in these positions does help build some more trust in the systems themselves and for them to be able to advocate, right, for community members on the ground. So that's just one, right, strategy that kind of speaks to both the grassroots and the grass tops. Like, who do we want to see, right, in positions of power, and how can they be people that we trust, right? That's one strategy that kind of bridges grassroots and grass tops that we use a lot.
Ooh, I love that. I love getting people elected who we really want to see represented by and for our communities. And I was on a call once and somebody, I said, I advocate for, and they corrected me and they say, you advocate with. And I was like, that's right. So Michelle, I think you were leaning in to maybe speak to this.
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to piggyback on Candace's comment with respect to trust, right? So, to answer your question specifically, Julie, like, is it an either or proposition, or can't we do both? I think we have to do both, right? Like, I think that's a given. But I also know that, it can be exhausting to try to tackle things from both sides of a thing, right? Like, we know we need the representation at the federal level, right? And there are plenty of organizations that are doing work that are, but the challenge in that is a lot of those organizations historically have not been broad enough or wide enough to be inclusive in the entire arts ecology, right? We know that some of those, the big national arts advocacy organizations are talking to this narrow field of arts practitioners, right? And so, then the question becomes, well, then how do we, make either change those larger institutions to be more inclusive and representative of all of us, or do we just not? Do we just say, no, thank you, we're going to figure out something on our own? And I think what we're seeing across the country broadly are these smaller satellite collectives of people coming together saying, we're tired of waiting for, the big monster in the room who's supposed to be representing us to actually represent us. So let's figure out how we do this on our own. And I'd love to shout out right now to one of our sister organizations at Reach, which is NALAC, the National Association of Latino Arts and Cultures. For years and years and years, Maria de Leon, waited for these large national institutions to represent her community and her constituency, and they never did. And they never raised the issues that were important in her community. So finally, she just was like, enough. We're going to create our own national advocacy work. We're going to go up to Capitol Hill on our own and talk to the people we need to in partnership with the Hispanic Caucus, right? So at a certain point, you get frustrated waiting or having expectation for change that just isn't coming, and then you have to redirect. And so, I'm very excited right now about what I'm seeing across the country with respect to people just saying enough is enough. We need to figure this out on our own. And so we're seeing a lot of, Black, Latino, Indigenous led advocacy initiatives coming. We see the state folks connecting with the regional folks, connecting with the municipal folks, and then trying by extension to connect to some of the larger groups that are doing good work, like the Cultural Advocacy Group, to try to then create a network tapestry of advocacy that will be representative to everybody. And that work to me is very exciting and is long overdue. But, to the earlier point, it's so hard to dismantle the monster that you're a part of, right? You're trying to do it from the inside out. You have to play by the rules of the larger sandbox. We all do. We're all taking money from philanthropy. So we're all part of the mess that we're trying to decolonize and tear apart. But you're trying to dismantle the monster as you're sitting in the stomach of it, and it's a challenging tension, to be sure.
Absolutely. And it is, I appreciate everything you just said, though, too, because I think it paints a hopeful picture in terms of empowering people to engage, and that there is opportunities for all of us to engage and to have that collective response, and hopefully a much more inclusive tapestry with a different level, a different leadership than we've had for hundreds of years, is going to really create that systems change that I think we're all interested in seeing happen. But you talk a lot about, and I think it's also very true, which is fatigue, trauma. And I think that self-care has become more a sort of a dominant thing I've ever seen in conversations in business than I've ever been in before. And I wonder, in terms of that, in terms of the work that you're all doing, what does that look like in terms of keeping the momentum going? And what does that look like in terms of things that we can create differently? So we're not the nonprofit industrial complex that does expect people to work insane amounts of hours for very little money, with almost most of the time without benefits. And so let's talk a little bit about what you're seeing, or in the work that you're doing within your own organizations, of how do we do this differently? How do we support the workers, the people who do the work here, to maintain this level of intensity to create the difference that we need? And what does that look like in terms of policies that support self-care? Anybody have thoughts on that? Okay, I'm going to call on someone then. All right, Isa.
Yeah, I think we're all sort of Brady Bunch looking at each other.
Yeah.
The first thing I thought of is, quite often at Yerba Buena, it seems as though I work in a big mansion. And I say that with a smile, because Yerba Buena is an incredible presenting space. We've had Steve Jobs at one point in time publicized his first models of the iPhone. We've had, this is a funny story for a different time, Fabio on an elephant. And yet, to bring it back to today, we are emerging from the longest mass closure of performance venues since World War II. And most harmed in that fray are the Black and Brown, the artists of color at the heart of so many of our programs. And so a question that we have at YBCA as we grapple with the pandemic and try to reopen safely, how can we open and reopen our spaces and truly be a center of the people beyond, say, a performative phrase on a website? Because we know that during the pandemic, and this is true of many of the artists in our guaranteed income pilot, they have said to us, this is the most injured I've ever been in my career, because of navigating threats of displacement while trying to find performance spaces. So to take it back to self-care, often the simplest answers are the best. How can we open our doors so it's not just, yes, we're operating a guaranteed income pilot and we're moving the needle on policy, but how are folks eating? Are you breathing? Do you need a room for a meeting? And because YBCA is rooted in the South of Market neighborhood, we have office space. We're in the process of thinking through what would a more human membership model look like, right? So if I'm an artist in San Francisco and we are increasingly seeing artists having to leave San Francisco proper and super commuting from Fresno, from Solano, because of the rising cost of living, can we offer up that space in a meaningful way? So just to start the conversation there.
Yeah. Isa, thanks for that. Having lived in the Bay Area for so long and now living outside the Bay Area, I'm really struck with, I didn't even realize how hard it actually was while I was there. And everything that you're saying is bringing back that reality that we're in a new reality now with the kinds of questions that are being asked at the beginning of any kind of relationship. And I think that's really good. There's a new accountability with how, we have a big national youth media initiative, and all of the kind of blueprint steps of how you begin conversations, how you create rituals around gathering, the questions that are, it's like the pedagogy is not changing as much as like these cares being foregrounded in ways that were just completely skipped over before and we didn't realize it. The other thing I'm seeing a lot that is, I think, that's really wonderful is worker organizing, and the kind of the organizations that we heard Michelle speak of before, when the larger, institutions aren't answering our needs, the smaller, more regional organizations insisting on the stories and the people that we care about, needing a voice there. I'm finding that organizations like Documentary Producers Alliance are coming up saying, not only are we advocating for our people on sets, but we're also advocating for the earth and the environment, and asking for non-extractive production models, and not waiting for the others, the big guys, the studios, whoever, to legislate for what's necessary, because they won't do it. And instituting practices that are their own small policies that will eventually, I think, become part of the system. It's just going to take a little longer, all the way up to the International Documentary Association unionizing just this month, and having, yes, it took a crisis point to pivot there, but they got there, and it's changed everything. And so I think this, again, in that new era of accountability, of the intersection of ecosystems that are covering the groups of working artists whose needs are profound. And if we don't meet them, there is a sense that there is a kind of self-selected censorship and of culture. And so all of this accountability is leading to so many places, which again speaks to that either or thing again. It's not either or. As Michelle was saying, we must do both. And I think all of this so far, it's nice to see these new kinds of articulated accountabilities coming up and really making some systems change.
Michelle, Candace, I just want to invite you to be able to either respond to any of the things anyone else is saying, or I can certainly lead us into the next thought. No? Okay.
I'll share a little bit. This is a huge topic, so I have a lot of thoughts spinning around, but I was just thinking about, for folks who are like in this space, in this room, there's probably a lot of folks from organizations, I'm sure, and one thing that I think we've been trying to do at Apano is to kind of model and practice what is possible in terms of working. There's part of that is like hugely trying to build this culture of trust in which folks feel comfortable saying like, hey, I need a mental health day, or hey, like there's like too much on my work plan, so that it's not so that there are supportive systems in place right? And that folks can take the time that they need, and also like beyond that, that there's an acknowledgement of how hard the work is, and what can we do as leaders in the organization to make this place as sustainable and centered on folks' needs as possible, right? Because the organizing role is also super ripe with burnout. Like it is like right in front of us all the time. So I think we take this question of like care pretty seriously. And with that too, right, that means we also have to be pretty brave in telling funders like, look, we can't do it on that timeline. Or like, look, we need general operating funds, and really pushing back against some of the kind of cultures of urgency of funders like dictating, right, our own work plans to an extent in which we are burning out. So I know that's not necessarily within the kind of federal or state policy level, but thinking about like what can you do in your organization to create a space that is truly caring, right, and like human-centered and humane, right? And that might look like, shortening the work week. That might look like putting some policies into place internally that allow for people to take more time off, or to have a more flexible schedule, or provide benefits around childcare, right? There's a lot of ways that can look, but really putting some intention and energy into that, and not just assuming that the benefits that we've had, right, are just the ones that are currently on our plates are going to work for everybody now, and even if they've ever worked for everybody. So kind of maybe starting hyper locally is probably one suggestion for this particular question.
No, I think that's really important. We have to look at our own organizations. And I think there's been a lot of folks who have been looking at their own organizations in these last 2 years in particular, and hopefully going on the journey to be anti-racist organizations. And I, because I can tell, a white-led organization ourselves, we are on that journey, and it's something that we are committed to, but we understand that it's certainly not a statement that we can make and write and then say, hey, we're an anti-racist organization in any way, shape, or form. And learning so much about how, as you're all talking about, the systems that all of this has been built upon, and who are we holding responsible for that, and how are we making that change happen? And what are we doing? What are we truly putting into practice to make that change happen? And I guess, we have a couple more minutes, and then I think we're going to open it up for audience questions. But just I'm thinking about these last 2 years, as I think, Isa, you were saying, we're so adaptable, right? As humans, right? We just kind of, we're going through a global pandemic. 1 million people have died in the United States. We have seen, obvious, not obvious, but it's been much worse for Black and Brown communities than it is for other in facing this pandemic. The needs are urgent right now, right? Maybe more than they've ever been. I don't know. I can only say what I know today. I don't know what it was like 100 years ago. What have we learned? What are we going to do differently that we didn't know before the pandemic? Now that you see what we just experienced, which was not only intense in terms of the devastation and the death and the highlighting of the inequities, but we also saw policy shifts and respond in ways that we'd never seen before. Right? They were able to address some issues quickly at the federal, state, and local level to give out money to, as we all shut down. What did that teach us? What can we do to change things going forward? And now I'm talking about public policy. Does anyone have thoughts on that?
On a very simple level, the National Endowment for the Arts moved quickly to distribute general operating funds in a way that it never had. We were always used to doing one-to-one matching for the project grants, and this was the project, and this is what, and so the amounts went, for those who could qualify. And I guess that speaks to the persistent inequities within the program, but they did shift a practice. And while it uncovered more of those inequities, the outcome from that, I also found to be the formation of some new organizations that could move institutionalized money through to the communities more quickly. The establishment of organizations like Color Congress, to be like, we're designed for those who are traditionally not seen by the nonprofit foundations that traditionally give. And so I think there was some shit, and in the workforce world, the proliferation of funding that could go to nonprofit arts organizations, community-based organizations, they're trying to push money out the door that has way too many rules encumbered by it. And so there you have workforce boards with money that needs to get sent back to the government because they can't spend it. There's the broken system that is apparent over and over again in workforce systems, and where that feels like too big of a fight to fight, certainly for an organization like the Alliance, but we can at least start to be part of the conversations and to work with workforce boards to get them to understand that artists are at work here and we can help them spend that money. And if we can free it up, but it's nice to see the institutions giving away more money a little more freely, but the work has only just begun for real.
Well, and as you said, Michelle, in the beginning, which is that it was trending, right?
Mm.
And now we're starting to feel that the trend is moving away already. So what do we do to sustain it, to not be a trend, to not be a pilot, but to truly make fundamental changes, systems change?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's always so frustrating because it always feels like it's on the backs of, right? It's on the backs of brown and black folks and Native Indigenous folks to raise these issues with philanthropy, to raise these issues with folks that are on the front lines of the arts advocacy because of historical, the way that it's kind of played out. But I love, Wendy, to get to your point, it's just like I feel that, there have been some small things that I think, if we could just get the message that, hey, look at all this money you were able to disperse to the arts community without strings attached, or with minimal strings attached. And look how well all these organizations managed that and dispersed it and got it to the ground and got it to the front lines. And this should perhaps be a practice moving forward, that we don't need to jump through all those hoops. We don't need to, give you all this data and all these, reports. And, in the NEA, yes, but the NEA is such a small, right? I know we hang our hats on it because it was the gold standard back in the 80s and it's what we all, but it's just such a minimal part of what could be accomplished and achieved for funding for the field. And I know that NEA getting that money out the door, having colleagues and friends who were based there, it almost killed them, right? Because they are so understaffed to be able to do that. So yeah, I just think that there are so many lessons for policy folks, for advocacy people, for philanthropy, to Candace's earlier point, for institutions and organizations to start to understand what it means to be a people-centered organization and not a product-centered organization. There's just so many lessons here. But the question is, whose obligation, whose stories are to be told in this, and where does that lesson get told, and to who, and whose shoulders do that sit on? And I hesitate because I feel like the people who probably would be the ones to be the knock on the door of philanthropy and be like, hey, did you notice you didn't need all that stuff to give the money away? Wasn't that great? Let's keep doing that, right? But who's going to be the one to tell that? And I get a little frustrated by that because I feel like that then falls back again on communities, on artists, on the folks that are on the front lines doing the work, exhausted, to then have to say, oh wait, it's starting to shift back. We got to move the ship back the other way because it's starting to go the other direction. And so it's it needs to be done, but it's frustrating because it always seems to fall on the shoulders of the people that are the most impacted to be the communicators of those messages.
All right, I hear a collective call to action right there, to hold accountable and to also be to really talk about what we just all experienced and what works. And I mean, I heard somebody say poverty is a policy choice, right? And what we learned these last 2 years is that there are choices that could be made differently. That doesn't mean we all have to live in that the majority of Black and Brown and Indigenous people of color have to live in poverty. And so, I mean, you know, we do need to hold the systems accountable for that, both in private philanthropy and in public dollars. Obviously, sometimes trickier in public dollars, right? That whole narrative. I mean, I sometimes if I get the narrative around, well, it's your taxpayers' money, therefore we have to do it differently. It's like, but who are those people who are paying the taxes? Shouldn't it go back to that? Shouldn't they be the ones making the decisions? So it is 12:16, and I think we're inviting in Lauren from Westaff to see if there's audience questions. And I think that's what's happening. Am I right? Oh, and I said 12:15 because I'm in California, but I guess it's 1:16. Yes, Cynthia says yes, that's what we're doing. There she is. Welcome. Oh, you're muted.
Ain't it the way? Hi, everybody. My name is Lauren Wilson. I'm the Financial Processes Manager at Westaff. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a white woman with long brown hair and a black shirt. And I am joining from Denver, Colorado, the ancestral lands of the Ute, Arapaho, and Cheyenne peoples. And I'd love to field some questions from the audience. You can ask in the chat if you're more comfortable that way, and I can kind of ask it to the panel. You're welcome to just kind of ask away yourselves if you can unmute yourself. But if you have any questions from the audience, I'd love to focus on those first. Give it a second to see if any kind of come through the chat. All right. Anyone feeling bold with any questions? No? Okay. I'm keeping, yeah.
People who are in the audience.
Yeah.
Kidding.
I'll keep an eye on the chat, but I guess just to start right now, how do we connect cultural advocacy and cultural production? Like how can we as organizations help support artists in their political activism in their communities? And how does your work at the grassroots level connect to those statewide or federal advocacy efforts, if at all? It may not.
I can take this one. Oh, Candace, do you want to go first?
Sorry, I'm sorry if I cut you off. I think my internet is like very tired today.
No worries, no worries. Go ahead.
Yeah, just one quick thing I would say is that people live multidimensional lives, and I think one thing that is really interesting in my organization is that I think we tend to focus a bit more on issues, in terms of like things we want to organize around. And there are always artists who are within that issue, right? So sometimes thinking about like, well, what is the change we want to make, right? And like having this, I don't know, a little bit of confidence that like there are artists and like cultural workers and creatives in this sphere of the work. And not thinking about the arts or artists as like a separate category that we have to go consult, right, to serve this particular like mission or campaign. So really kind of like taking that to heart is one way I think that we think about it. But also, we're always like organizing folks who want to contribute to the movement, and there are a lot of folks who want to, use their creative skills in a way that helps do advocacy and like change the way we even talk to like legislators, policymakers, etc. So there's a lot of, potential in we've like made zines and stuff for like our, our legislators, and like that's something that doesn't always show up on their desk every day. So yeah, there's a lot of creative tactics that one can use here.
Yeah, so I didn't.
And I would just add, tying in the question of self-care, where and how do timelines factor into this all when we think of advocacy and who is in the mix? There's a wonderful book by Brescia Wade, who is a Black doula in the East Bay area. And she writes that borders are violence and timelines are borders. And to say that often, while we may be quick in deploying funds, whether it's at the federal level or the state level, take our COVID relief funding, for example, who gets left out, right? And so often in the world of guaranteed income, we're also finding that this is quite true. If a timeline is moving urgently, folks will be left out. It's a matter of what communities do we want to reach, and are we truly moving at the pace of process versus trying to get something out the door? Because we know that bad policy can often lead to bad policy, but also bad funding can lead to bad funding. So just for us all in whatever capacities we are, whether grassroots, grass tops, funders, conveners, are we truly making space for equity at each step of the way?
All right. And then I guess this is more of like a kind of pie in the sky question that I really enjoy. What policy changes or benefits that you've seen in your organizations are really inspiring to you? They may not be within your organization if you maybe don't have something that you're just like, I really crushed this and helped everyone else with this. But what are some of the more inspirational movements that you find that you're kind of drawing from? They don't have to be arts related necessarily. I mean, you can pull. I mean, movements pull from so many different other organizations, and we're all kind of, a rising tide lifts all boats. So you might not have an arts specific example, but something that could be applied to the arts or your organization.
There's too many. I don't know. like, I'll pick one. I am encouraged by the mass practice of taking a hard look at what our federal poverty level means. Part of this is often in my day-to-day, I can get in the weeds of guaranteed income. And we talked about this earlier, but our current system is set up often so that someone who is participating in a basic income or guaranteed income pilot, often there's an either or. So if I'm an artist in San Francisco in YBCA's pilot, I may lose certain public benefits. This could mean in California, CalFresh. Sometimes this can mean housing. It can mean all sorts of benefits that should not, because of the scarcity narratives and policies in our economy, should not be the case. What we do know about the federal poverty level is that it's an antiquated formula that's, it's over 60 years old. It presupposes that a family spends a third of its budget on food, when we know in so many parts of the country this is simply not the case. In California alone, childcare increasingly is actually overtaking housing as a top cost for families. It's wild. Because of GI, because of us just really coming together to look at the intersectionality of our social safety net, there is some encouraging work to understand a more human, there's the word again, way to define economic security. And that's tied to narrative too. That's tied to why is it that, for example, childcare work is often seen as unpaid labor, right? What are some of the really toxic narratives behind that policy? So I'd say, Lauren, it's hard to answer that question because everything is so intertwined, but we'll just kick us off with a look at economic security.
Speaking of how things are intertwined, we have a question from the audience from Sarah Lewis. Can you speak more about how aligning arts workers with other types of workers in the United States? Where have you seen this work within your communities? Kind of how are all related and integrated?
I'm happy to respond to that question, actually, Lauren. And so I have a great example to offer for that, which is Alternate Roots was a part of a collective that came to be in response to the pandemic in the South called the Southern Power Fund. And that was a collective of about 20 organizations, of which there were only 2 arts organizations, Alternate Roots and Agri Arte out of Puerto Rico. But the majority of the rest of the groups were all coming from, predominantly social justice orgs. And again, during the pandemic, same narrative, we knew organizations in the South aren't going to be getting the national funding. We need to figure out how to do this ourselves, and really started, meeting on a regular basis and convening. And, the thing that allowed that to work well is that were pre-existing relationships that we had. So the trust didn't need to be built. It was out of the gate. The trust was there because a lot of these organizations were legacy historical organizations that had pre-existing relationships, including the Highlander Center, Project South, Southerners on New Ground. But it, for me, was one of, when people say, like, what are moments in the pandemic that as a leader you're most proud of? And I always talk about the Southern Power Fund and the pride that I had being a part of that collective to partner with Southern movement, community, grassroots, frontline organizations and get money mobilized. And we, over the course of an 18-month period, raised $16 million to go to disperse out on the ground. And that was done through a collective of organizations, some very forward-thinking philanthropy organizations. And it was, to me, a perfect example of how arts can partner, collaborate, and join with other movements, other organizations, other fields, other sectors to become part of a more powerful force. And that organization and collective still exists to this day. We are still very much involved in it. We are continuing to raise money because what we know for sure is that, the pandemic is the tip of the iceberg. And, when you think about, what's coming down the pike in the South, with climate, we're going to be at the front lines of all the climate disasters that happen as well. And so we know it's just going to be one thing after another. And so we are, trying to be proactive in how we are doing that. And so just to take that a step further, like actually looking at seeding organizations on the ground in certain regions so that when those moments happen, activation can be immediate, right? Mm-hmm. Like saying, let's find organizations who we know are going to be on the ground in this particular region, who we can pre-seed funds to, so that when those moments happen, we're responding to that, right? So I think that organization, and you can look it up online at fundthesouth.org. And I think it is a beautiful, beautiful example of how arts organizations can partner with other institutions and organizations to forward advocacy for their communities in their regions on the ground during times of crisis.
Yes, we must.
Hey, Lauren, I would just add that also what we found in California was how critical it was not only to align ourselves and to follow and to look at other movements, but also to build coalition within our own sector, because often we're quite siloed in the arts and culture and the creative industries. So it's been also really critical to build within and as well as look outside at commonalities. So I think we're 12:30. Lauren, did you
Yeah.
want me to? I know you need to jump off, and
Yeah, I was going to say, I was going to turn back to either the panel themselves or if Cynthia would like to pop on to kind of give us a closing statement.
absolutely, please.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Lauren, for doing the Q&A. Thank you, panelists, for joining us. I think this has been a really informative discussion, and some of these themes that have been drawn out, we're really glad to say that we'll be exploring them more deeply later on in our next session, especially talking about how arts advocacy can align with other movements. So if that's of interest for you all, I encourage you to stay on. And then as well, a lot of these resources that you all have mentioned in examples, we're keeping a running list and we'll be posting links to all the relevant things on our ALICE website so we can, so you all can check back on that as well. So thank you so much for all of this really informative discussion, and thank you panelists for all of your contributions. All right.
Thanks so much.